A closer look at dietary trends, how nutrition recommendations influence the economics of food, by Madeleine Gould Gamache. In this report, the influences of major dietary recommendations on economic factors of different types of foods in a time when nutritional information was changing drastically are examined, so as to see how the first official political American dietary recommendations changed the face of the agricultural market. Americans care about their health and are always optimizing in order to reach the best health status they can. Because of this, Americans are widely influenced by the media and other publications that use scientific basis to recommend or caution against certain foods. We will take a look at the effect of the Dietary Guidelines of 1980 on the markets of eggs, fats and oils, and grains. After the end of World War II, Americans were celebrating their victory by consuming a diet full of rich and fatty foods. Senator George McGovern of South Dakota noticed that many of his fellow congressmen were dying of heart attacks and brought to the attention of the U.S. Senate the importance of alerting Americans to the link between diet and disease. As a result of his setting the ball rolling, the dietary goals for the United States were published in 1977. After the dietary goals were released, the first dietary guidelines for Americans were established in 1980. We will take a look at how this first official governmental nutritional initiative, the first dietary guidelines, affected Americans' diet through economic trends as seen from data downloaded from the USDA's Economic Research Service. Egg consumption reached an all-time peak of 404.6 eggs per capita per year in 1945 after the end of World War II. Egg consumption has since been on a steady decline, which was accelerated in the early 1960s with the release of the first 5 years of data from the Framingham Heart Study, which showed that elevated cholesterol was an unmistakable risk factor for heart disease. Figure 1 shows egg consumption peaking in 1945, then decreasing, especially after the early 1960s. The indifference curve is shown for this example. In the case of preliminary results from the Framingham Heart Study and other information from the American Heart Association, Americans learned that eggs were a cholesterol-rich food and cholesterol-rich foods were not a desirable dietary component. As a result, they began to cut back on their consumption of eggs. Expenditure line and indifference curve A show the point at which consumers in 1960 were willing to spend on eggs and the prices at which they were indifferent to and will still buy eggs. However, with the change in dietary guidelines and the news that eggs contain about 190 milligrams of cholesterol per egg, consumers decided to move away from purchasing eggs. The price at which they were willing to buy eggs dropped, and their willingness to buy other products increased, as did their buying power for those other products. The dietary goals for the United States released in 1977 included the following goals. 1. Increase carbohydrate consumption to account for 55 to 60% of the energy intake. 2. Reduce overall fat consumption from approximately 40 to 30% of energy intake. 3. Reduce saturated fat consumption to account for about 10% of total energy intake and balance that with polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats, which should account for about 10% of energy intake each. Following this, the first dietary guidelines for Americans were published in 1980. Aside from maintaining an ideal weight and eating a variety of foods, the third main point in this document quotes, avoid too much fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. This guideline pointed out that one shouldn't cut out fats entirely from the diet, but must ensure that these are consumed in moderation. In the next few years, the amount of saturated fats consumed by Americans, which had been increasing, and particularly steeply so since the early 1970s, leveled off entirely. As seen in Figure 4, the consumption of butter and lard, saturated fats, both decreased markedly between 1980 and 1990. In contrast, the consumption of monounsaturated and polyunsaturated salad and cooking oil and shortening increased. The supply and demand chart pictured here shows how the shift in demand for saturated fats affected the price and quantity of butter when the first dietary guidelines for Americans were released in 1980. As Americans determined that saturated fats were less beneficial for their health than other fats, they shifted their preferences away from the purchase of butter as well as lard and towards shortening and salad oils. This changed the equilibrium quantity and price of butter. Though there are not official public records on the sales and market entry of low fat and fat free foods, milk serves as a proxy for this entire market. As Americans shifted their consumption towards foods with less saturated fat, whole milk consumption decreased, while 2% reduced fat milk consumption increased, and 1% in fat free milks increased also. Despite the fact that consumption of high fat foods was decreasing, caloric intake was still increasing, as seen by this chart. Calorie availability per capita per day increased from around 3,100 calories per day in 1960 to around 3,750 in 1990. Logically, this shift in supply was based on a shift in demand. If Americans were consuming less high fat foods, which contain 9 calories per gram versus the 4 calories per gram in other foods, where did they get the extra calories from? The answer lies with grains. In the same breath that the dietary guidelines for Americans recommended decreasing the saturated fat foods consumed, they recommended increasing carbohydrate intake with the following words: if you limit your fat intake, you should increase your calories from carbohydrates to supply your body's energy needs. Figure 9 shows the increase in carbohydrate foods from grains consumed. This was mainly wheat flour, but total grains consumed also showed an increase, which really took off in the early 1980s. In Figure 10, the indifference curve is shown for the consumer's shift in preference from saturated fats to grains. As the consumer is less willing to buy saturated fats, their level of preference for grains increases, and they are willing to spend more money on grain foods, carbohydrates, in order to optimize their health. This PowerPoint has discussed the ways in which the American food system changed with respect to the dietary goals for the United States, the first dietary guidelines for Americans released in 1980. The changes seen here show how a governmental publication or science and the media can change Americans' perception of certain foods. This shows that Americans are indeed optimizing their diets constantly and always looking for ways to better their health. On this slide are the references used in the past slides.